Hi folks, Josh Knight the First here with another episode of Rider Rebuild, coming to you with episode 33 of the series. Let's get right into it. So this week on Kamen Rider Build, we've come to a point where we're getting a new villain who's really an old villain, but now in a new form, and things are about to get very dark. And I know that's saying a lot for a series like this, where we've had a lot of twists and turns, and things getting bleak for our heroes, but things are really going to get bad by the end of this. But first, let's go ahead and start where we left off last week, with the Prime Minister being, kidnapped. Before we get started, I do want to appreciate that the show addresses a question that I had at the end of last week's episode, which was why didn't they get Ryuga to try and use Pandora's box? Here at the beginning of the episode, we see he's actually trying to do it, and Misota's pulling it back from him. But apparently she couldn't use it either, so I guess that eliminates the two of them from being able to use it at will. So yes, Prime Minister Himuro has been kidnapped by Nanba Heavy Industries, and they're holding him ransom in regard to getting Pandora's box back. No, wait, that's not actually the case this time. Isurugi goes ahead and calls Sento and tells him, look, we'll go ahead and give him back to you, but we want a specific item from you, something called the Evol driver. Now, in typical bad guy fashion, Isurugi tells him you have 24 hours to deliver it to this location, otherwise we're going to go ahead and off the Prime Minister. Now, this leads to the search for the Evol driver and a giant plot dump, which really takes up most of the episode. Evol has this ability to go ahead and use Pandora's box's power by use of this thing called the Evol driver. Now, this is apparently an artifact that Evolt had back on Mars. Now, they don't blatantly say whether or not Evolt is the one who built it or he had someone build it for him on Mars, but the important part is that he was trapped within Pandora's box, we see via some sort of a flashback, and then he infected Isurugi when he came into contact with Pandora's box, and we see the pieces of it laying on the ground there on Mars. Now, apparently when Isurugi was brought back to Earth, in process, he went through a kind of a fever in order for Evolt to adjust to his new host body. Now, they don't blatantly say this, but this is text that you can read off the screen that Sento is looking at, and it's all in English, and very legible English, very understandable English, so I applaud them, whoever was working on that. But that having been said, we see that Evolt has had this plan in motion for a long time, so yes, this goes ahead and excuses Isurugi for the entirety of the series. We've been dealing with Evolt this whole time. Now, Isurugi himself, we see his personality is still in there, so he could technically be saved at some point, and it's important that Misota knows this, but at the same time, I don't think that as a story, that's going to mean a lot that we get him back. I don't think he's going to meet a good end. Now, we're further told that Shinobu Katsuragi, who is Katsuragi's father, actually helped Evolt try to fix this thing, this Evolt driver, but Katsuragi himself found it and hid it away to make sure that he couldn't use it. The unfortunate thing about this is that Katsuragi kind of underestimated his own intelligence, in that his later self, Sento, was able to find it pretty quickly. Now, I imagine that finding it in two pieces makes sense on a certain level. Maybe at some point Katsuragi thought that he could use that power later on down the road, which is probably why he did that. But at the same time, if you thought it was too much of a risk, you wouldn't leave it in two easy to find, easy to fix pieces. You would destroy that mofo outright. On top of that, if Katsuragi hadn't done it, Katsuragi's father should have done it, when it says there in the report that he drew up that this Evol driver has the power to give Evolt control over the universe. Sento says as much, because he's just reading it off the report from his dad. He has no reason not to trust his dad, so if this is that much power in this little device, why would you give that back or leave it open to where the bad guy could get it back? And I get it, we need an end boss, and Evolt does seem to be that end boss that we're looking towards. It's not going to be Gentoku, maybe even less Utsumi, but I think it's a lot of very self-serving things for the plot to make it that easy for Evolt to get this power back. Now, on the opposite end of town, over at Nanba Heavy Industries, we see that the Prime Minister, yes, has been taken into captivity, and that Utsumi is actually really power-tripping right now. I don't understand why he's so upset at Gentoku last week and his father this week. He's kind of having a lot of repressed anger issues going on right now, which he probably should deal with. We see that the Prime Minister is still trying to reach out to his son, telling him, look, I know you want to unite the country, but you can't do that unless you care about the people that make up this country, and those people are suffering right now because of your actions. Now, Gentoku, as we've seen over the last couple of episodes, is kind of developing as a character. We see him below the surface, really considering things. Is this really what I signed up for? And this episode really is the breaking point for him as a character. Once Utsumi informs him that, very cavalierly, we're going to kill him no matter what happens, Gentoku decides enough is enough, I'm going to break him out, and I'm going to make everything right. or at least he tries to. The unfortunate thing is the device in his chest actually has two remotes, one held by Utsumi, which he bothered to get away from him, but Bloodstark had one as well. Now I do have to give credit to Bloodstark in that he enjoys his role as the villain here in the series so much that he doesn't mind spelling out everyone else's motivations. In this case, spelling out for Gentoku that he's actually been a good guy for some time now, that the process for him becoming a Kamen Rider actually undid the effects of the sky wall appearing earlier on in the series, and that light that bathed everyone, their leaders of the country, and made them more aggressive. The Kamen Rider process undid that, so really this whole time he's been in his right mind. As such, he decided to go ahead and play the part of the villain because he thought that was necessary to go ahead and get the country united, but his endgame, Gentoku's endgame, was to actually give the country back to his father because he knew his father would be a better leader than he could be. That's very selfless, and I appreciate that they showed that part of his character to us now. Otherwise, it would have been harder to deal with later on down the road if we were told that later. Now, once we get to the actual hostage exchange, we see that Sento has fixed the Evol driver and is going to give it over to Bloodstark. But the thing of it is, the action that comes up in the next part of this, when everybody gets into a tussle and the fight breaks out, is that this is another episode where the action choreography just wasn't that great. And the focus, again, is more on the story, but we kind of needed the action to match that. Really, we get that in the last fight, but it's a very short fight and for good reason. The other interesting thing about this fight that I want to point out, or really this whole episode, is that we never actually see Grease in action. Well, we see Grease's suit, but as for Sawatari, he's never actually seen on screen. We just hear his voice in suit. And it is him there speaking, but I wonder what his actor was doing where he couldn't be on set this week. But thankfully, since Sento was able to help Gentoku with the device and essentially deactivated, we almost have dedicated 4 good writers to the cause here. Now, I wouldn't call Gentoku a fully fleshed out Kamen Rider just yet, but he's going to be building towards that by the end of this episode, with one particular thing in mind that a lot of Kamen Riders have in common. The unfortunate part about this episode is that try as the heroes might, and even though they get every advantage they should have, unfortunately it's just some people who want to see the bad guy succeed, namely Utsumi. Utsumi's still very much believing in Nanba heavy industries, not so much what Bloodstark is doing, gets a hold of the Evol driver and gives it back to Isurugi. Now that he has this power again, Evolt is essentially unstoppable, and we're shown that in quick order. By using the Cobra bottle and the Rider System bottle in the Evol driver, Isurugi, nay Evolt, can now transform into this new rider, Kamen Rider Evol. Now at first glance, as far as the suit goes, yes, it is very bulky and very busy, but the thing of it is, it's important to point out why exactly they designed him like this. If you look at the things on his arms, the pauldrons on his shoulders, his chest, and his helmet, these are actually nods to old-fashioned navigation equipment that old explorers would use back in the old world. The side of his helmet has a sextant, the middle of his chest has an armillary sphere, and the middle of his faceplate right above his eyes, where his eyes would go, is what we would call a star wheel. These are all different pieces that the navigators would use to position themselves over the ocean to see where they were in relation to the constellations. Now you will notice that the constellations there when he first transformed are kind of outlined there very blatantly. Now I thought about this and actually looked it up with the star chart, and from what the star chart shows, it's actually lined up based on where your position is, based on what time of the year it is, based off month. And sure enough, the positioning of the stars on his face based off what it is now makes sense because it was April. The star chart is for April, and that's what they showed on his face because that's when the episode aired. That's a little nod you wouldn't know unless you actually looked it up. Also, in the transformation itself, it's interesting that one, it's Evol's voice there in the driver, so I imagine he did have some sort of hand in building it if he put his own voice in it, kind of like Ryoma Sengoku putting his own affectations into the Sengoku driver back in Drive. But all the same, we hear the jingle in the belt because for the last several years, rider belts have had jingles, but I swear I heard Ode to Joy there, and since we had a little bit of that a couple of episodes ago, I wonder if that wasn't done on purpose as well. But it is interesting to think about whether or not Evolt could hear Beethoven on Mars, but that's a question for another day. Now we do see that Kamen Rider Evolt is both very quick and very strong, and is able to undo Gentoku's attacks very quickly, and has him on the ropes, and is almost about to off him because at this point he's had enough of his treachery. The unfortunate thing we see here that the episode was building toward is that his father sacrifices himself to take that death blow for his son. And again, we're shown a death where the audio is focused on the vocals, not so much the soundtrack. There's no music playing while unfortunately Himuro is passing away. He pleads with his son, pay for the debts that you have accrued on yourself, unite this country, I'm entrusting it to you. And that's it. He doesn't have a lot to say because he doesn't have a lot of time. That was a very serious blow he was dealt to himself, but even more so to Gentoku. And that's where the episode ends, just him crying out for his father, everybody there watching. Unfortunately, Sento and Ryuga weren't there to see it, but I imagine they're going to have some feelings about it come next week's episode, when we also see that Evol, with this new power, is going to directly attack Sento. So yes, we had another episode here where the focus wasn't on comedy. There's not a lot of jokes in this episode. The focus is on the storytelling. And yes, it's very dramatic, and I appreciate the show for showing as many on-screen deaths as they have, and they're permanent, which actually I appreciate. If something has weight to it, then it should stick. It shouldn't just be undone simply. And I get it, a lot of characters mean a lot to us as an audience, but sometimes we just have to let them go. Now, no, I don't necessarily agree with a lot of the decisions that the heroes made in this episode, but at the same time, it goes back to the saying of you can only do what you can with the information you have at the time. If Sento had any idea that Evolt would become this powerful if he gave him the driver, he probably wouldn't have put it back together. Oh wait, everybody warned him about that. It's there in his father's notes, which is why I don't really get why he did that. But those, of course, are my thoughts on the episode. I want to hear what you guys thought in the comments below, so let's go ahead and talk about a few things. First off, Sento. Do you think that Sento should have fixed the Evol driver like he did, or should he have found a way to disable it in giving it to Bloodstark? Secondly, Utsumi. Seeing how he effectively screwed everybody over in this episode, just how long will it take before he wises up to Nanba's brainwashing? And thirdly, Gentoku. Now that he has unfortunately lost a family member, and now that he can have this as a driving force, will this make him a full-fledged Kamen Rider? You tell me in the comments below. And of course, during the week, you can always talk to me on social media. On Twitter, I'm at JoshKnight1st. This has been episode 33 of Rider Rebuild. For episode 33 of Kamen Rider Build, Evol, the Final Weapon. I'm Josh Knight the First. I'll see you guys again next episode.